welcome to CTA Tax. All right, some new faces, familiar faces, old faces. How's it going, guys? Ready for the year? All right, okay. So I'll be taking you for tax. So both full-time and part-time, I'll be taking tax, all the lectures, all right, which is cool for me because I can do what I want. All right, which means that today, what time are we knocking off? 6 o'clock? 7? Okay. All right, guys. So from a knocking off perspective, I will try and make sure that we leave here at 4:30 latest. Okay. Have to go to church. I am a religious person. Okay, so I will let you go at 4:30. Is that cool? All right. Cool. Second thing, books. I know a lot of people have been asking, do we buy the books? All right. Let's see your packs. How thick are they? Printed packs. Can you see the printed packs in front of you? Guys, expertly written. Stephen was the architect of these notes. They're way better than some books that are out there. Trust me, they are. Right? I have dealt with Axum. I have dealt with the other book. Right? But guys, trust me, those notes are pretty much what you need. Okay. I will add onto that pack. All right. So don't stress. It's still small, but this is an introductory lecture. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay, so you don't need to buy the book. If you do need to buy the book, well, you can spend the cash. It's all good, all right? So don't buy the book because the notes have been properly written. I promise you. You will pass this year. Obviously, if you put in the hard work, but you will pass if you use only the notes that we're going to give you. All right, and I also give handwritten notes, okay? Unfortunately, our printer is down today, but you will collect them in the next class, but I will give you the handwritten notes before you ask me to print them. I know some of you will ask me to print them. All right, and then from a consulting perspective, should we consult? Can we consult? Do you have time to consult? Yes, 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 and yes. All right. If you want to consult, you feel that you need something to consult on, you're struggling with the concept, I will be available to consult. But guys, let me tell you something. Right. From a consulting perspective, last year, some people were using me as a sounding board. All right. So what they'll do is they don't study, then they say, can we have 2 hours, please, 2 hours? All right. I'll give them the 2 hours and they use me as a sounding board. Please don't do it. All right. If you want to consult, if it's a genuine thing, I am available to consult. Cool. Any other admin stuff that you need me to deal with? Yep. You don't need to get the new cycle legislation. Anything else? As long as you've got last year's copy, it's fine. Cycle legislation, that's the only thing that you need from a tax perspective. Orange book is fine. Anything else, admin? Yeah. Come again. You will not have time to read that. Not have time to open that. So it doesn't matter. There's something that was taken out from the old book, but it's fine. All right, so advanced questions. All right, let me deal with advanced questions, and I have to mute this. Okay, so how are we going to tackle tax? So some of you have attended my undergrad classes, all right? So from an undergrad perspective, this is what I used to do. All the theory up front, and then we do practice questions. Going to do the same. Unfortunately, tax is boring, right? And unfortunately, I have to do all the theory up front. Okay, so for the coming 4 hours, guys, I will keep a lot of theory on you, all right? And thereafter, we'll do some practice questions. Okay, so how I'm going to do it, I'm going to dumb it down very much, okay? Some people think I'm very slow, right? But that's the only way we can do it. We dumb it down, but do a lot of theory up front, and then in the next session, then we're going to do more advanced CTA level 2 stuff. Okay, Why do I do this? I do this because about 50 to 60% of your marks are going to be what? Dumb stuff. Does that make sense? So if you don't know the dumb stuff, guess what? Will you pass the exam or will you not pass the exam? Chances are you won't pass the exam. So that's the way that I'm going to teach you tax this semester. All right, so let's look at what's happening from a level 1 and level 2 perspective. So for this test, right, we need to do donations tax, we need to do value added tax, and we need to do introduction to taxable income. Is everyone comfortable with that? All right, so this lecture, I'm going to do donations tax and I'm going to do VAT. In the next lecture, I'm going to do advanced VAT and I'm going to do introduction to taxable income. All right, so I'm going to start the lecture with value added tax. So we're going to look at value added tax. All right, so it's not the notes were designed to make you work in class, so you have to find that. It's in that pack, that thin pack. Yeah. You guys to be awake, eh? Make you find stuff. Found it. Where's Wally? All right, there's the VAT. Everyone comfortable with it, guys? Okay, found it, ready to go. All right, so let's look at value added tax. What is VAT? Got a few intelligent people in the room, some with cum laudes in their undergrad. All right, some barely making it in undergrad. It's all good. But I think everyone knows what is VAT. What is VAT, guys? Tax on what? Tax on consumption, right? So who pays the VAT? Who pays the VAT? All right, so the person that pays the VAT is not SPA, is not a VAT vendor, but the person that pays the VAT is the end user. Does that make sense? So if you go to SPA and you buy a book, right, and they charge you VAT, right, you pay VAT and SPA collects the VAT for STARS. Does that make sense? So you need to understand that VAT is charged on consumption. All right. So from a VAT perspective, right, so we say VAT is charged on consumption. So from a VAT perspective, VAT therefore is going to be levied, right, by a VAT vendor that supplies goods or services. Does that make sense? So when you go to SPA, SPA as a VAT vendor is then going to levy VAT. Does that make sense? So therefore, VAT is levied on one, very important, supply, two, of goods or services. All right, and that is by someone that is registered as a VAT vendor. And the very important thing there is that this needs to be what we call carrying on an enterprise. Okay, guys, I will print the handwritten notes. They will have the stuff that I'm saying here in the next class. Okay. So, VAT is levied on the supply of goods or services by a VAT vendor. As I said, guys, your notes have been written by Stephen. So if you see any strippers or any poles, right? No, it's not me. It's Stephen. Okay, cool. All right. Just in case you see any prostitutes in the stuff. Okay, it's not me. Just a disclaimer. All right, cool. So let's look at the concept there. Supply of goods or services by a vendor when they're carrying on an enterprise. What is a supply? You need to understand what a supply is. And guys, you now in CTA, right? Okay, some of you have been in CTA for a while, right? But you still understand the fact that unlike undergrad, you actually have this stuff at your disposal, right? So if you look at the VAT Act in your legislation, so from the next lecture, you need to bring your legislation. Does that make sense? Okay, so this lecture, I'm not going to do any tagging, but in the next lecture, I will. So there is a definition for supply. There is a definition for goods or services. Does that make sense? So there needs to be a supply. So simply put, what is a supply? Right? A supply can be an actual transaction, or it can be a deemed transaction. You need a supply of goods or services. It can be an actual transaction. It can be a deemed transaction. Actual transaction. You go to Spar and you what? Buy a book. Makes sense. That's an actual transaction. Or it can be a deemed transaction. A deemed transaction is a transaction that actually hasn't taken place, but it's deemed to be a supply from a VAT perspective. So give you an example of a deemed transaction. A deemed transaction is, for example, a fringe benefit. An employee is given an asset. Make sense? When an employee is given an asset, the employer is deemed to have supplied goods, and therefore output VAT has to be charged. Does that make sense? Okay, so therefore we're going to look at actual transaction, and we're going to look at deemed transactions. Okay. So we're looking at a supply of goods or services. All right, so let's look at from a goods or services perspective. So there is a supply of goods. You go to Spar, you buy a book. What is a book? Goods or services? Goods. Everyone comfortable with that? So will Spar levy VAT? Yes, they have supplied, and yes, they have supplied what? Goods. All right. So there is a definition for goods, and you guys need to look at that definition. You need to scrutinize that definition because from a CTA perspective, that's what they're going to ask you. Right? So they will say in a question, whatever security company supplied a dog to you, security dog to you, right? Sold a security dog to you. Will you levy VAT on that transaction? Then you will say, was there supply? Yes or no? Yes, of goods. Then you have to look at the definition. Is a dog goods? All right? And the definition of goods excludes animals. Does that make sense? Okay. So we will look at that definition in more detail once we start tagging that. Okay, and I'll do that in the second lecture. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay, so is there a supply? Yes, of goods. You have to look at the definition. Certain things are excluded. Animals are excluded. Gold coins are excluded. And we have money also being excluded there. So of goods or services. Supply of goods or services, right? If you write an opinion, is that a service? Yes. If we're giving out or issuing an opinion, we are supplying a service. Does that make sense? So therefore, if there's a service, then you fall under that ambit. Okay. And important thing, guys, is services include certain things and also what? Exclude certain things. So therefore, we have to look at that definition in more detail. Does that make sense? All right. So supply of goods or services by someone that is registered as a vet vendor. So if I start my own business and I'm selling books to you guys, will I charge VAT? Okay. I have to look at the fact of the matter, which is I'm either registered for VAT or I am not registered for VAT. If I am registered for VAT, what does it mean? I will charge VAT. Just want to check. Okay. So if I'm registered for VAT, I will charge VAT. If I'm not registered for VAT, then I will not charge VAT. Does that make sense? All right. So if you're looking at a VAT vendor is going to register compulsory registration or what we call voluntary registration. Okay. So there's compulsory registration for a VAT vendor and there's voluntary registration. Voluntary registration if your taxable supplies exceed what amount? Voluntary, guys. Voluntary, guys. 50,000 rand. Compulsory registration if your taxable supplies exceed what? 1 million rand. Okay. So compulsory, 1 million rand. Voluntary, 50,000 rands. Okay, guys, that's per year, right? In that year. Okay, so if you expect, or if you've actually, if you expect, then at the beginning of the month, if you have made 1 million, at the end of the month, you have to register. Okay. All right, and there are also other requirements as well for compulsory registration, which I will specifically look at once we start tagging in the next session. Does that make sense? All right, so for example, if someone is a non-resident and they offer electronic services, all right, so if they offer electronic services, they're non-resident. If their threshold exceeds 50,000 rands, then they have to compulsory register for VAT. But I will look at that section in the next class. Does that make sense? Okay, so just know that there are other requirements there that we will look at in the next class. So, supply of goods or services by someone that is registered as a VAT vendor. So you are now registered as a VAT vendor. SARS then classifies you into different categories, right? There's category A, category B, category C, D, and E. Do you remember this from undergrad? Okay, hopefully you do. But if you don't, good thing again, UNCTA, they have given you a book, open book. You have your book, you know what section to go to, and you look at that section. Does that make sense? Okay, so category A, category B, those are 2 months. Category C, that's a 1 month cycle. Category D and category E usually don't come in your exam. Does that make sense? Okay, so once we start tagging the books again, we will highlight those categories, right? And we will show you exactly the different number of months in that category. Is everyone comfortable? Okay. So we have a supply of goods or services by a VAT vendor, and this VAT vendor needs to be carrying on a enterprise. Okay, so let's look at what carrying on an enterprise is. Carrying on an enterprise basically means that there's continuity in what you're doing. Make sense? There's continuity in what you're doing. So for example, if you go to Spa, do you think there's continuity in what they're doing? What are they doing? Selling stuff. Is that continuity? Yes. Does that make sense? So therefore, that is what an enterprise or carrying on an enterprise is. So let's look at something that is not carrying on an enterprise. Right? So let's say that you have a hobby. Does that have any continuity? Chances not. Does that make sense? You do it for fun. So therefore, excluded from carrying on an enterprise will be what? Anything that you do as a hobby will be excluded from carrying on an enterprise. Make sense? All right, and there are other things that are also excluded from this. All right? So hobby or recreational stuff or personal stuff that's not carrying on an enterprise. Paying salaries is excluded from carrying on an enterprise. So if you see in a question that they give you salaries, What are the implications of salaries? No implications, and the reason why? Not carrying on an enterprise. Guess what? You're now in CTA. You have to use the correct terminology. If you use the wrong terminology, even if you have a zero at the end there, like put a zero, that there are no implications. Okay? So let's say they ask you, what are the implications? And you put nil, but you write something that is totally nonsense. Right? Guess what? They're going to give you nothing for it. So if you see salaries, what are you going to say? Not carrying on the enterprise. Cool. All right, so paying of salaries. That is not carrying on an enterprise. All right, there's also the supply of commercial accommodation, which is less than 120,000 Rand. So if you have commercial accommodation that does not make more than 120,000 K, then that is not carrying on an enterprise. Supply of commercial, sorry. Okay. My best handwriting is Times New Roman, so please forgive that. All right. Cool. So let's recap. If you supply goods or services, you're registered as a VAT vendor, and you're carrying on an enterprise, then you're going to levy what? VAT. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay. So let me give an example. SPAR sells you a book. Will they levy VAT on that transaction? Yes. Make sense? Okay. If I, as a registered VAT vendor trading in my name, were to sell you books, will I charge VAT? What's the key thing there? I'm registered as a VAT vendor. All right? So therefore, a person can be registered as a VAT vendor. Company can be registered as a VAT vendor. A partnership can also be registered as a VAT vendor. So the important thing is you need to identify whether the person is registered or not registered for VAT. Does that make sense? Okay. So supply of goods or services by a VAT vendor, right? Carrying on an enterprise. Can I also include on this list what is excluded from carrying on an enterprise? And guess what? Any exempt transactions are excluded from carrying on an enterprise. All right. So there needs to be a supply, needs to be the vendor, all right, and there needs to be goods or services that have been supplied. Yes. All right. Can I get to more specific stuff at a later stage? Okay, and then we can ask those questions. Okay. So, therefore, if SPAR were to sell you a book for 10 Rand, if SPAR were to sell you a book for 10 Rand, what does that mean? That 10 Rand is inclusive of what? VAT. Is everyone comfortable with that? So therefore, if we are to strip out the VAT component of that transaction, we multiply that by 14 over 114. All right. So basically, it brings us to a point where we're looking at things that are including VAT and things that are excluding VAT. All right, so certain transaction will be including VAT, certain transaction will be excluding VAT, right? In your questions, they specifically need to state what? It's inclusive of VAT or it's exclusive of VAT. All right. If it's inclusive of VAT, you're then going to multiply that by 14 over 114. Is everyone comfortable? If it's excluding VAT, we're going to multiply that by 14%. Okay. Guess what? If you read the question wrong, right, and you don't get that right, probably half your marks are gone down the drain. So what does it mean? Highlight, put circles, scribble around that inclusive or exclusive, because it's going to give you a lot of marks. Make sense? Okay, so that's one of the most common mistakes that we find in papers. People multiply by 14 over 114 or by 14%. Okay, cool, guys. So times 14 over 114 or times 14%. So looking at the example that I gave you earlier on, you buy a book for 10 Rand. So therefore, we know that that is times 14 over 114. So therefore, guys, in some of your questions, they're not going to specifically tell you this stuff. Does that make sense? You're now in CTA, right? Putting on the big boy pens, right? So they're not going to always tell you the stuff. All right? So if you're reading through a question and if you have seen that someone has what? Paid. What does that mean? That amount will be inclusive of VAT. Or if they have received something, that amount will be inclusive of VAT. Make sense? Okay. All right. So if they tell you that this is the consideration, if they tell you that the consideration for a transaction is so much, they're basically telling you that it's inclusive of what? That. All right. And the other thing that you need to look out for is if they tell you that the market value of something is X, then they're basically telling you that that is what? Inclusive of that. Okay? All right? And there's some transactions, deemed transactions, which are always inclusive of that. An indemnity payment is always inclusive of value added tax. Right? And the other thing that is always inclusive of value added tax is second hand transactions, or where we claim what we call notional input VAT, right? So they won't tell you whether it's inclusive of VAT or exclusive of VAT. You have to know. And if you don't know, don't get the marks. And guys, this is a silly mark. That silly mark is the difference between 49 and 50. Make sense? Okay. All right, so certain amounts are inclusive of VAT, certain amounts are exclusive of VAT. If it's inclusive of VAT, times 14 over 114. If it's exclusive of VAT, then times 14%. Okay. So I gave you 3 packs. One pack was for the notes. The other pack is practice questions. Right. So VAT detail practice example number 1, you will see in your homework pack. Right. That's part of the homework that you need to do. It's part of the homework you need to do. Practice example 2 as well. Okay. And this will mark in the next class. Okay. So you need to do it and we'll mark it in the next class. Right, as I said, the puzzle continues. I want you to find activity 1 in that pack. Okay, so after the practice questions, there's a donations tax question, then we have activity 1, all right, and activity 2. So on the 1st of March 2015, Anne Smith commenced a gardening business. She's trading through a closed corporation, sole member, registered for VAT. It's the first tax period, which is the 1st of March to the 30th of April. Calculate the output VAT, indicate whether it's input tax, whether input tax can be claimed back, and all amounts what? Include VAT. So that's one of the first things that you need to be looking out for. All amounts include VAT. So therefore you know that you're going to multiply by 14 over 114. Does that make sense? So therefore, just put somewhere there 14 over 114 so that you don't forget. All right. Going back again to the top there. So we've got Garden Solutions, registered vendor for VAT purposes. So this person will levy what? VAT. Everyone comfortable with that? Okay. And we have invoice basis, which I'll look at just now. And we have a tax period, which is from the 1st of March up until the 30th of April, which in this case is a what? 1 month or a 2 month cycle? 2 month cycle. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay. So that's us reading a question. That's how you have to read your questions. All right. So going back to what we said when we began, VAT levied on supply of goods or services by a VAT vendor carrying on an enterprise, correct? All right. Some amounts will be including VAT, some amounts will be excluding VAT. Right. But for someone to be registered as a VAT vendor, they have to have what we call taxable supplies. You need a taxable supply. Okay, if it's not taxable, then what is it? Non-taxable. Or it is, more specifically, exempt. So you've got a taxable supply, you have an exempt transaction. So taxable supplies will be taxable at what rate and what rate? 14% and 0%. Does that make sense? So therefore, in a question, they can tell you that so-and-so has supplies, right, which are levied at 14%, and let's give a number, let's say that's 750,000 rands worth, and they can tell you that they have 300,000 rands worth of zero-rated supplies. What's the total there? 1,050,000. Should they register for VAT or should they not register for VAT? They should, because they're what? Taxable supplies exceed what? 1,000,000 rand. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay, let's play around with this a bit. All right, 1.2 million rand, 14%. Should they register for VAT or should they not register for VAT? Should register for VAT. Everyone comfortable with that? Okay. Let's make that 900. Let's make that 300. Should this person register for VAT or should they not register for VAT? Should not. Everyone comfortable with this? Okay. And we call that 1.5 million rand. 300K. Should they register or should they not? They should. And let's call that 1.5 million rand. Let's call that 300. Let's call that 600. Should they register or should they not? Should not. Is everyone comfortable that your taxable supplies include 14% and 0%? Everyone comfortable with that? Okay. So then what's the difference between 0% and exempt? At the end of the day, how much VAT will you levy? Is it the same? Yes or no? Probably, since I'm asking the question, the answer is going to be what? No, right? Okay. So if it's 0%, what it means is you can levy VAT at what percent? 0. But you can claim VAT at what? It's not 14%, it's what you have actually paid. Does that make sense? So VAT here is going to be levied at 0%, and input VAT is going to be what is paid. Does that make sense? All right. So that's a zero-rated transaction. But let's look at an exempt transaction. Output VAT is going to be what? Will you levy output VAT? Nothing. Nil. Zilch. Make sense? Nothing. You cannot levy VAT. No VAT levied. It's not carrying on an enterprise. Do you remember that? So you cannot levy VAT. Right? How about input VAT? Nothing as well. You cannot claim input VAT. Okay, so can you see the difference? Zero rated, you will charge, but you will charge at 0%. Okay? But exempt transaction, you cannot charge, you cannot claim. All right. A very common example that you will find of zero-rated transactions, right, deals with a very common transaction, guys, of zero-rated transactions is what we call direct export, which I'll look at just now. All right. And your residential accommodation being exempt transactions. But let me look at that just now. So, looking at zero-rated transactions. Who can name a zero-rated transaction that they know? Zero-rated? Fuel. Agriculture, correct? What else? Basic foods. What else? Do you know that's zero-rated? International transport. Exempt transactions. Financial services, correct? Residential accommodation. Local transport. Road or rail. Education. Okay. Guys, you're now in CTA. Good thing is you have the stuff in your what? Legislation. All right? So as we start tagging, we'll start highlighting these transactions. But you'll see in the notes that we gave you, we have what we call a VAT dash sheet, which is on page 7. Okay, so if you look at that VAT dash sheet, it basically gives you a list of transactions that are zero rated, exempt, or where there's no VAT levied on those transactions. Okay, so guys, when you go home at 4 o'clock, right, instead of checking whether Arsenal have bought Aubameyang or not, right, this is what you should be looking at. Does that make sense? Okay. Football at the end of the year, not now. Cool. So you guys need to know what's zero rated, what's exempt. So may you, if you're ahead of me in the fantasy league, I'll know. You're not reading. Okay, need to be reading this. Cool. So fuel, zero rated. Direct exports, zero rated. International travel, zero rated. Can you see those transactions there? Zero rated, including property rates and taxes. Guys, you need to know this. This needs to be second nature. When you see a question, you pick up immediately whether it's zero rated, exempt, or you can levy VAT at 14%. Okay. So going back to the question, so I did jump the gun a bit. Clearly. Right, if you look at activity number 2, activity number 2 has got standard rated transactions, zero rated transactions, and exempt transactions. So transaction number 1 is income from selling beer in South Africa. Right, is that zero rated, standard, or exempt? Standard. Everyone comfortable with that? Anything that is luxury, okay, will be 14%. Income from selling beer in Botswana. Direct export, which will be zero rated. Everyone comfortable? Income from tenants of residential accommodation. If you say zero rated, I will strangle you. Okay, it is? Okay, clearly you want me to strangle you. Right, so this is exempt. Guys, you need to get it right. If you say exempt on a zero rated transaction, you'll get it wrong. Okay, and I was going through last year's paper. There were so many easy marks that so many people got wrong because they were going the opposite direction. Okay, so for the coming 2 weeks, guys, I need you just to look at, don't look at the fancy, okay, let's, what you call this, reference and stuff like that. I don't want you to reference. I don't want you to worry about, I don't want you to worry about tagging. Do not make those books look like Christmas trees. All I want you to do is make sure you get the zero rated exempt transactions correct. It's all you have to do. Does that make sense? Then in the next session, then we start looking at the complex stuff. Does that make sense? Okay, so I've given you the 2 practice questions. These 2 practice questions here. Right? These 2 practice questions have everything that you can think of from a zero rated, exempt, or standard rated perspective. If you can get 100% of this right, then I'll be happy. You can move on to the next stuff. If you get it wrong, then I'll repeat this lecture again. Just joking. Clearly. All right. So supply of goods or services by vet vendor. Right, we've looked at inclusive or exclusive. We've looked at taxable supplies and exempt transactions. Okay, so guys, for the coming 2 weeks, you have a crutch. Right, you can use that VAT dash sheets to identify transactions. After 2 weeks, burn that page. Right. Try and put the stuff in your mind. Okay, so I've got taxable supplies and we have exempt transactions. Example number 1. We have someone that is registered as a VAT vendor who makes a sale to someone that is registered as a VAT vendor. Okay, someone registered makes a sale to someone that is also registered. Okay, we're looking at a standard rated transaction here. Okay, 100 Rand excluding VAT. So therefore, including VAT, that amount will be what? 114. Is everyone comfortable with this? Okay, so therefore, this guy here will charge output VAT, and that output VAT is going to be what? 14 Rand. And this guy here will what? Claim how much? Input VAT, and that input VAT is going to be what? Guys, this is what I used to do when I was a student back in the day. I would look at the transaction. Who's trading with whom? Right? VAT vendor trading with the VAT vendor. Make sense? So in this case, your normal rules are going to apply. Does that make sense? So, what are your normal rules? VAT is going to be levied at 14% on the earlier of what? Invoice or payment. So those are the normal rules, general rule. This is using the invoice basis. All right, there's a payments basis. Okay, payments basis. I have never seen a question at a CTA level in a long time, but the notes are there. You can read up on the payments basis. Cool. All right. So normal rules, earlier of invoice or payment. Let's look at transaction number 2. I know it's not as glamorous as you would have wanted it to be. All right. We've got a VAT vendor, standard rated transaction to someone that is not a VAT vendor. Think about it. What's going to happen at the top? Will you charge VAT? Okay, so you're going to charge VAT. Will you claim VAT here? No VAT claim. And guys, in questions, they can be that simple. But people miss it because they're not putting it into perspective. Does that make sense? VAT vendor selling to someone that is not a VAT vendor. Look at transaction number 3. Transaction number 3, we have non-vendor making a sale to someone that is registered as a VAT vendor. Person at the top, can they charge VAT? No VAT charge. Person at the bottom, can they claim VAT? All right, this is when we start looking at what we call special rules. All right, and that's what your syllabus is going to focus on, the special rules. All right, so there are certain special rules that we need to know. All right, so if we're dealing with a non-vendor making a sale to someone that is a vendor of new goods, what's going to happen there? No VAT charge. Will you claim VAT? No VAT claim. Everyone comfortable with this? And guys, a lot of people just look at a non-vendor selling to a vendor and what will they say? Notional input VAT. And guess what? That is wrong. Basic stuff. Okay. If we have second-hand goods, non-vendor making a sale to a vendor. All right. What's going to happen here? There's going to be the special rule. It's going to kick in. Whenever there's a sale of second-hand goods from a non-vendor to someone that is a vendor, then in that case, the special rule kicks in. Special rule basically says the person that's a vendor can claim notional input VAT. Does that make sense? Can claim notional input VAT. And the special rule basically is going to look at two things. One, it is going to look at the timing of that transaction. All right? So therefore, guys, when you're going through a question, when you pick up a special rule, you will always get 1 mark for identifying the timing of the transaction. Make sense? The second mark that you're going to get is going to come from the what? Value of that transaction. So anytime you pick up a special rule, identify the timing, identify the value of that transaction. Timing of this transaction. What is the timing of the transaction? Upon payment. So the VAT transaction will only be triggered by payment. If the non-vendor supplies the goods, the VAT will only be levied when, only be claimed when the vendor makes a payment. Make sense? And guess what? 1 mark for that in the exam. It's not good enough to just say there's notional input VAT. You have to say there is notional input VAT, the timing of that transaction is upon payment, and the value of that transaction will be the lower of two things, market value or cost, whichever is lower. Okay, so as a general rule, guys, this is a general rule. Anytime you're dealing with input VAT, you will always go with what? Lower off. Anytime you're dealing with output VAT, you will go with greater off. Okay, so and in this transaction, we're dealing with notional input VAT. So therefore, it needs to trigger in your mind that you're going with the what? Lower off. Not sure whether this makes sense, guys. So let's go to activity number 1. All right. If you go to activity number 1, remember all amounts are inclusive of what? VAT. But what type of transaction am I dealing with? What type of transaction? Whether they tell me that all amounts are inclusive or exclusive, I have to know that it will always be what? Do you remember this, guys? Second-hand transaction will always be what? Whether they tell you that it's inclusive or exclusive, I don't care. I know that all second-hand transactions are what? Inclusive of that. Okay, so let's go back to activity 1. So I'm going to pick on Garden Services solution point number 4, purchased for cash a second-hand computer from Sister. This is a what? Non-vendor making a transaction with a what? Registered vendor. What type of goods are we dealing with here? New or second-hand? Second-hand. Will the special rule kick in? Yes. What is the timing of the special rule? Upon payment. What are we told in the question? Or what? Cash. So does that trigger the input VAT claim? Yes. Makes sense? So therefore, your claim will be 85 times 14 over 114. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Let's go to point number 1. Point number 1 says, on the 1st of March, Gardening Solutions purchased a second-hand bakkie. Can you see that? From a used car dealer for 61,650. The used car dealer agreed to allow the corporation to settle the purchase price in 3 equal installments. Second-hand. Yes. Notional input. Yes or no? Notional input, yes or no, guys? Get caught your tongue, guys? Yes or no? Okay, because I asked so many times, that's why you're saying no, right? Okay, why are we saying no? So used car dealer was also a registered VAT vendor. What does that mean? Normal rules apply. You will charge VAT, you will claim VAT at the earlier of invoice or payment. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay. So a lot of people look at the word second hand, but they don't do the simple thing of vendor versus vendor. Can you see how easy it is to fool you in an exam? Okay. So guys, that's why I'm dumbing it down. Dumb it down for yourself in the exam as well. Take your time. Rather finish 75% of the paper, but you've picked up all the transactions. Make sense? Okay. So everyone comfortable with the vendor-to-vendor transaction? All right. So that was on your second-hand goods. Now let's look at connected persons. So put on your auditing hat. Put on your auditing hat. What is the risk of connected persons? Transactions not at arm's length. I'll tell Millie she's doing a good job. Right. Okay, so transactions are not at arm's length. So if transactions are not at arm's length, then they're going to manipulate the VAT that is going to be charged on transactions. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we have a VAT vendor who's making a sale to a registered VAT vendor, right? Is there risk there? Think about it. One person will charge VAT and the other person will claim VAT. So let's say they pitch this transaction at 100,000 Rand. This guy will charge how much? 14,000 Rand VAT, and this guy will claim what? What's the impact on SARS? So if they Gupta gate this whole thing, right, charge 10 million Rand, will there be an impact on SARS? So what's going to happen if a VAT vendor is dealing with a registered VAT vendor and we have transaction? Normal rules will always apply. Even if they're connected, no impact on SARS. Does this make sense? Okay, let's look at transaction number 2. And we're still dealing with connected persons. One person is a registered VAT vendor. Okay. Sorry, let me change that before I get to the registered VAT vendor. Let's say we have a non-vendor. Let's say this is the director. and he sells his car or computer to the company. Are they connected? Yes. Right. Non-vendor selling to a vendor. Computer that he used at home, he's now going to use it in the business. What are we going to claim it at? Will there be a risk? Okay, the risk is going to be there because he can Guptagate this and charge it at 10 million rand. But from a from a SARS perspective, is there going to be an impact? Lower of cost or market value. We say this was what? Second-hand goods. So therefore, your second-hand goods will always fall under what? The special rule that deals with second-hand goods. Because they'll always make sure that it's always at the lower of cost or market value. Does that make sense? Okay. So even if you say it's 10 million rand and the market value is 100, it's always going to come to the lower. SARS does not lose out on that transaction. Okay. Transaction number 3 is we have a registered vet vendor who is making a sale to a non-vendor. So anytime you supply goods or services, you have to do what? Charge VAT. All right? So where's the risk? They can take 100,000 rands worth of goods and sell them for what? 10 million rand. If he sells them for 10 million rand, what's the issue there? SARS benefits. Make sense? So therefore, this guy will rather sell the goods for what? 1,000 rand. Because if he sells them for 1,000 rands, instead of charging 14% on 100,000 rand, they're now charging 14% on what? 1,000 rand. So therefore, if it's an output VAT transaction, it will always be at the greater of market value or the cost. So if you have connected persons, right, you will always charge VAT at the greater of the two. Okay, so your cost is 1,000 rand. Market value is 100,000 rands. You always charge VAT at the greater of the two. So therefore, guys, there's a special rule on what? Connected persons. Right? The special rule on connected persons will only kick in when a vendor makes a transaction with a non-vendor. Make sense? So vendor makes a sale to a non-vendor, then in that case, output VAT will be charged at the greater of market value or cost. Remember, guys, this is the what? Value of the transaction. What else do I need? Timing. The timing of this transaction will be when the goods have been removed. So only when the goods have been removed will that transaction be deemed to have taken place. Okay, so therefore output VAT will be charged at the greater of market value or cost of the transaction. Any questions so far, guys? Okay, so we've dealt with 2 special rules. Special rule number 1 is second hand. Special rule number 2 is connected persons, where a vendor is dealing with a non-vendor. Everyone comfortable with that? Okay. All right, special rule number 3. Let's look at special rule number 3. And special rule number 3 is motor vehicles. So looking at the special rule on motor vehicles. Okay. So for your motor vehicles, that is going to be denied. So can I explain the concept of something being denied? All right. Can you all see this door? Can you exit through this door? Yes. Okay. But if I were to put a sign and write there no exit, what happens there? Can you see the door? Can you see the sign? Can you go out the door? Yes, you can, but you are what? Denied from going through. Does that make sense? So if you look at the concept of something being denied, yes, it's possible, but it's just denied. So from a motor vehicle's perspective, if I'm looking at a vehicle dealer, someone that buys and sells motor vehicles, is there continuity in what they're doing? Yes. So there's continuity in what they're doing. So therefore, it's carrying on a what? Enterprise. So that person carrying on an enterprise will be able to charge VAT and will be able to what? Claim VAT. Does this make sense? Right? This will be on two things. If it's a motor vehicle as defined, right, on the sale of that motor vehicle and when you hire that motor vehicle. So Avis rents out motor vehicles. Is that their business? Yes. Is there continuity in what they're doing? Yes. Is that carrying on an enterprise? Yes. They will charge VAT and they can claim VAT. Make sense? Okay. So therefore, if it's a motor dealer, VAT is not denied. All right? If it is a motor car, okay, need to be more technical. If it's a motor car as defined, right, then in that case, VAT is going to be denied. You're not a car dealer. You're just a business that is registered as a vendor. You buy or sell a vehicle, VAT is going to be denied on your transactions. So you cannot claim input VAT on the purchase of a motor vehicle. All right, so let's go back to activity number 1. Remember we said we've got a second-hand car, which was a bakkie. So in this case, guys, why did you claim VAT? Is a bakkie not a vehicle? Okay? But now, from a VAT perspective, it needs to be a motor car as defined for you to deny the VAT. So what is a motor car as defined? So you need the definition of a motor car. So you need to go to your legislation and look at what the definition is, right? The definition includes certain things. So for example, this type of vehicle needs to have more than one seat. It has to have more than one seat. So what does it mean about one-seater? What's a one-seater that you know? Motorcycle. Is it a motor car as defined, a motorcycle? No, it only has one seat. It has to have more than one seat to be a motor car as defined. So, can you say this? Therefore, motorcycle, not motor car as defined. So if it's not a motor car as defined, you can claim that. Does that make sense? Okay, so not a motor car as defined, claim that. So on your motorcycle, you will claim that. Okay, what else is included in that definition of a motor car? Right? A motor car has less than 16 seats. So if a vehicle has more than 16 seats, what does that mean? It's not a motor car as defined, so therefore you can claim the VAT. So more than one seat, less than 16 seats. All right? It needs to have more than 3 wheels. What does it mean? Tuk-tuks, tuk-tuks, whatever they're called. Are they motor vehicles as defined or not motor vehicles as defined? Not a motor vehicle that's defined, so therefore if you have a tuk-tuk, you can claim what? VAT. Makes sense. Okay. So more than one seat, less than 16 seats, more than 3 wheels, right? More, basically, more passenger space than load space. More passenger space than load space. If you have a BMW 3 Series, which one is true? More passenger space or more load space? Passenger space. Everyone comfortable? So BMW 3 Series is going to be a what? Motor car as defined. Double cab bakkie. More load space or passenger space? Passenger space, so therefore it's a motor car as defined. Everyone comfortable with that? Okay? Single cab bakkie. More load space, so therefore, going back to this question here, second-hand bakkie, if they say bakkie in inverted commas, they're basically meaning a single cab bakkie, so therefore you can claim that. Does this make sense, guys? So for that transaction, you're going to be able to claim the VAT. All right, so your motor car excludes certain things. All right, so there's some vehicles that are going to be converted, right, from a passenger vehicle to something. Yes. More seats, more than 16, less than 16 seats. So 16 seats and above is going to be a not a motor vehicle. Did I say more than 16? So it's 17 and above, sorry. The sign. Okay. No, I'm right. It is less than. Okay. All right. Guys, it is a Sunday, right? Arsenal didn't play yesterday. It's out of the FA Cup, so I am a bit dazed. Okay, cool. And Sanchez went to Manchester United, so yep, I'm not on my A game here, guys. Okay. All right, so I'll give you a break just after this, guys. So, motor vehicle excludes certain things, right? Certain vehicles are converted for specific purposes. So, for example, your game viewing vehicles, right? The important thing there, guys, it needs to be for game. Does that make sense? So, in a question, they're going to say that this vehicle was converted for fish viewing. And guess what? It's still a motor vehicle as defined because it's not for game viewing purposes. Does that make sense? Okay, it needs to be for game viewing. Okay, and there's special vehicles as well. So, for example, a Formula One car, it's converted for a special purpose, right? It will have more passenger space than load space, right? But it will be excluded from the definition of a what? Motor vehicle. Okay, a hearse, for example, more passenger space than load space, right? But it's still excluded from the definition of a motor vehicle. Does that make sense? Make sense? Sorry. Okay. So we will look at that definition. We will highlight all those things when we're tagging, right? At a specific in the next class. Okay. All right, and that is VAT being denied. I think I should give you a break. Let's make it a 15-minute break. Please sign the register, guys. I need to collect it and take it back at 9:30.